Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Love on the Air. The world for Clara Vance began at 4:30 a.m. in the hushed cathedral-like quiet of the WROA studio. It was a space consecrated by routine, scented with the holy trinity of her professional life: the crisp, clean fragrance of freshly printed paper, the faint electric tang of ozone from the broadcast console, and the bitter ghost of yesterday's coffee. Here, in the sanctum of her soundproof booth, she was the master of her universe. Her voice, a smooth and measured alto, was an instrument she played with meticulous care for the listeners of City Sunrise, her news and culture segment that unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Her notes were colour-coded, her timing impeccable. Chaos, in Clara's world, was a myth. In the adjacent studio, chaos was signing off. Leo Croft's laughter tumbled through the thick glass, a warm, unruly sound that always seemed to defy the soundproofing. He was wrapping up the night shift, a freewheeling 3-hour conversation with the city's insomniacs, dreamers, and lonely hearts. Clara could picture him perfectly, leaning into the microphone as if it were a confidant, a stray lock of dark hair falling over his forehead, the worn leather of his jacket smelling faintly of the night air. He treated his callers not as an audience, but as old friends, their shared jokes and easy camaraderie a stark contrast to her own polished formality. The red on-air light above her booth flicked off. Clara allowed herself a small, controlled exhale. Another perfect broadcast. She began methodically organising her scripts into a neat pile when her monitor blinked with a message from Brenda, the station manager. Vance, Croft, my office. Now. Brenda's office was the station's nerve centre, a place where idealism met the harsh reality of spreadsheets. She sat behind a large desk, her expression one of grim pragmatism. "Close the door," she said, without it looking up. Clara sat in one of the stiff guest chairs. Leo ambled in a moment later, folding his long frame into the other, with a casual grace that she found inexplicably irritating. "Good morning to you too, Bren," Leo said, his voice still holding the warm gravel of his late-night broadcast. Brenda finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over them both. "I'll cut to it. The quarterly numbers are in and they're not good. We're facing significant budget cuts. As a result, we're consolidating. City Sunrise and the night shift are being eliminated." A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. She felt the neat stack of her scripts, the product of years of dedication, slide into a chasm. Leo leaned forward. "Whoa, wait. You're cutting both our shows?" "Not exactly," Brenda corrected, a faint, almost predatory glint in her eye. "I'm merging them. Congratulations, you two. Starting Monday, you're the new hosts of the 6 to 10 a.m. drive time slot. We're calling it Morning Rush with Vance and Croft." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara stared at Brenda, then at Leo, whose charming smile had finally vanished. He looked as horrified as she felt. Her, the queen of the prepared statement, and him, the jester of improvisation. It was not a merger, it was a collision. Their first show was, as Clara later recorded in her journal, a delightful disaster. She tried with valiant effort to stick to her segment on a recent city council meeting regarding zoning variances. The proposed ordinance, R225, would rezone the waterfront district for mixed-use commercial and residential properties, Clara began, her tone even and informative. From across the console, Leo chuckled. "Hold on, Vance, let's translate. The city wants to let bigwigs build shiny condos where Old Man Fitz's bait shop has been for 50 years. Let's get a caller on the line. Sal from the south side, you're on the air. What do you think about these mixed-use shenanigans?" Clara's jaw tightened. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in a soundproof room, and she was standing in the centre, holding a script that may as well be a single useless leaf. While personal anecdotes are valuable, she interjected, her voice tight, the specifics of the ordnance are crucial for public understanding. Come now, Vance. Leo's voice was a playful prod, a velvet-wrapped barb. Don't you ever feel the urge to throw the schedule to the wind? Tell us what you really think about the city's new parking meters. No notes, just feeling. The tension arced between them, a live wire of genuine annoyance and an undeniable crackling electricity. The hiss of static before a connection was made seemed to echo the space between them. And then the phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree. A woman named Joyce called in, laughing. "I love you too! You sound like my husband and me trying to decide on dinner." Another caller, a gruff-sounding man, said, "This Croft fellow's a menace, but damn if it isn't entertaining. Keep it up." By the end of the show, the station's social media was buzzing. The term hate flirting was trending locally. Brenda was waiting for them when they came out of the studio, a broad, triumphant smile on her face. "That," she declared, "was fantastic. The numbers are through the roof. Whatever that was, that oil and water, fire and ice thing, lean into it. It's gold." Clara looked at Leo, who was running a hand through his already messy hair. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, beneath the horror, she saw something else. A flicker of shared astonishment. They'd created a beautiful, chaotic mess, and the city was listening. The shared space, once a battlefield, slowly transformed. Brenda's decree that they plan the show together forced them into a reluctant armistice. Their battleground shifted from the on-air studio to the cramped production booth and the station's small, perpetually messy kitchen. Late-night planning sessions, which began with heated arguments over segment timing, gradually bled into something else. One evening, hunched over a stack of listener mail, Leo pointed to a letter praising Clara's segment on the Historical Society. "You really love this stuff, don't you? The dusty old facts." "I like stories with clear narratives," Clara replied, her guard firmly into place. "Things that are preserved. There's a comfort in it." She hesitated, then added, "My grandfather owned a used bookstore. I grew up surrounded by them." It was a small offering, a crack in the pristine wall of her persona. Leo didn't mock her. He just nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that," he said quietly. "I learned radio by recording stories on a tape recorder for my little sister. She was sick a lot. I'd make up these wild adventures to make her laugh." He shrugged, a gesture that was surprisingly vulnerable. "Guess I never stopped." In that small exchange, amidst the clutter of coffee cups and discarded notes, the characters of Vance and Croft faded, leaving just Clara and Leo. Their reluctant truce was tested when Brenda sent them on a remote broadcast to the city's annual food festival. It was a miserable, rainy afternoon. They were huddled under a small broadcast tent, the cheerful festival atmosphere dampened by a persistent drizzle. Halfway through their first segment, a gust of wind sent a sheet of rain sideways, shorting out their main mixer. Clara felt a familiar surge of panic. "We have dead air. We have to cut to commercial." "No, wait," Leo said, his eyes bright with a challenge. He pulled out his phone, plugged in a small professional-grade microphone, and hit record. "All right, folks, welcome to the real morning rush. Our equipment has officially surrendered to the great deluge of 25, so we're coming to you guerrilla style." He held the phone between them and pulled Clara closer under the small awning, their shoulders pressing together. "I'm here with the unflappable Clara Vance, who is currently trying not to murder me with her eyes. Clara, describe the scene." Something in his infectious calm disarmed her. "The scene," she said, a small genuine laugh escaping her lips, "is soggy. A man just had his prize-winning pumpkin pie turn into a pumpkin soup. The mayor is hiding under the hot dog stand." Leo bought them a shared cup of hot cider, the cardboard warm against their cold hands. They passed it back and forth, their fingers brushing, huddling together as they gave a wonderfully authentic, hilarious play-by-play of the dissolving festival. It was their most popular segment yet. The true turning point came a week later. A prominent city councilman, their lead guest, cancelled 5 minutes before he was due on air. Clara felt the world tilt. Her entire second hour was built around him. The colour-coded script in her hand was now useless. She froze, the silence stretching. Then Leo's voice, calm and steady, filled her headphones. "Well, folks, it seems Councilman Davies has had a change of plans, which brings us to a new topic, the best-laid plans gone awry. Call us with your stories of disastrous vacations, ruined weddings, and job interviews gone sideways. We've all been there." He handled the calls with his signature blend of humour and empathy, weaving a brilliant tapestry of shared human folly out of thin air. He had thrown her a lifeline, not with a grand gesture, but with quiet competence. After the show, the studio was silent. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a strange intimacy in its wake. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Any time, Vance," Leo replied softly. She finally looked up. He was watching her, his usual playful guard down, his gaze lingering with an intensity that made her breath catch. He reached over to the console and, on a whim, played a song. The soulful, yearning voice of Etta James filled the studio. "At last, my love has come along." Clara said nothing. She just listened, caught in the melody and the weight of his unreadable expression, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with cider and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. Success became a gilded cage. As the ratings for Morning Rush soared, the station entered its crucial spring rating season. The pressure from management, personified by an increasingly manic Brenda, was immense. The studio, once their accidental sanctuary, began to feel like a stage. "The listeners love the chemistry," Brenda announced one morning, waving a sheaf of printouts. "We need to up the ante, more personal stuff. I'm thinking an on-air date. We'll have listeners vote on where you go." Clara felt a wave of nausea. "Our private lives are not a programming gimmick, Brenda." "Leo, talk to her," Brenda pleaded. Leo leaned back in his chair, his easy charm now a thin, brittle shield. "You want chemistry?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or do you want us to sell tickets to our private lives? Because they are not the same thing." The line, once blurry, was now being erased entirely. For Clara, who craved control, the erosion of her private self was terrifying. For Leo, who used his charm to keep the world at arm's length, the monetization of his genuine, emerging feelings felt like a profound violation. The change was palpable. Their on-air banter, once electric with friction and wit, became a careful performance. They were actors playing themselves, and the strain was beginning to show. The breaking point came during a segment on regrets. The topic was Leo's idea, an attempt to steer back toward the authentic connection they had found. Clara, feeling a strange surge of recklessness, decided to participate. "I think my biggest regret," she began, her voice softer than usual, "is missing an opportunity because I was too afraid to be spontaneous, to deviate from the plan. I was so convinced that my way was the only way that I didn't realise what I was letting slip through my fingers until it was long gone." She wasn't talking about a job or a trip. She was talking about him, about the wall she'd built, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever said on a microphone. The phone lines glowed with callers sharing their own vulnerable stories. For a moment it felt real again, but Leo, stung by the constant pressure to perform and mistaking her confession for just another part of the act, missed it completely. After the show, as she was gathering her things, he walked past her desk. "Great performance today, Vance," he said, his voice cool and detached. "Brenda will be thrilled." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She had shown him a piece of her soul and he had called it a performance. He saw her as a character. Perhaps that's all she was. The carefully constructed bridge between them crumbled to dust. She retreated behind her professional wall, higher and colder than ever before. For the next few days, their on-air exchanges were brittle, sharp, and genuinely frigid. The silences between their barbs were heavy with unspoken anger. One afternoon, Leo put on the Etta James song, perhaps as a peace offering. As the first notes of At Last filled the studio, Clara reached over and, with a sharp, deliberate movement, switched to a traffic report. The listeners noticed. "What happened to Vance and Croft?" one tweet read. "They sound like they're getting a divorce." In the studio, the red on-air light, once a symbol of connection, now felt like an accusation, illuminating the vast, silent chasm that had opened between them. The storm broke over the city just after 9 p.m, a furious assault of wind and rain that lashed against the windows of the deserted WROA station. Inside, the only light came from the green glow of the audio console, casting long shadows across the studio where Clara was packing her bag. She was done. She would work from home, email her segments, do whatever it took to avoid the suffocating tension of sharing a room with Leo Croft. She was just zipping her briefcase when the studio door creaked open. It was Leo, his jacket dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked tired, stripped of his usual bravado. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Home," she said crisply, not looking at him. "I've arranged it with Brenda. It's more efficient this way." "Clara, stop!" She froze. He rarely used her first name. He walked closer, the scent of rain and damp wool filling the small space. The storm outside raged, a fitting soundtrack for the tempest that had been brewing between them for days. "I'm sorry," he said, and those words sounded as if they'd been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. What I said after the regret segment, it was cruel, and it wasn't true. He paused, searching for the right words. "What you said about being afraid, I heard you. I heard the real you. I was just too much of a coward to admit it because it scared the hell out of me." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "All of this," he gestured around the studio, started to feel like they were stealing something that was just ours, and I panicked. I pushed you away because it was easier than admitting how much it meant to me." As he spoke, a small unnoticed light on a secondary panel flickered, from red to green. A power surge from the storm had triggered a glitch in the station's emergency broadcast system, silently patching the audio from their studio directly onto the airwaves. They were live, their private reckoning broadcast to every radio in the storm-swept city. But they, in their isolated world, had no idea. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "You thought I was performing," she whispered, the hurt still fresh. "You thought the one real thing I shared was fake." "No," he said, stepping closer still. The cool surface of the broadcast console was cold under her trembling fingers. "I knew it was real. That's what terrified me. Because I'm afraid all the time, Clara. This whole personality," he gestured to himself. "This charming, chaotic guy. It's a script. One I've been improvising my whole life. And you are starting to see past it. And I am falling in love with you, Clara. The real you, not the one on the script." The confession hung in the air between them, more electric than any storm. She looked up at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and all the walls she had ever built turned to dust. She closed the small distance between them. He cupped her jaw, his hand surprisingly warm against her cool skin. His kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Hers was the answer. It deepened slowly, a language of its own, conveying all the arguments, all the longing, all the unspoken truths from the past weeks. It was a kiss of overwhelming relief, of profound recognition. Finally you see me. Finally I am seen. His other hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her close, not with force, but with a reverence that made a shudder run through her entire body. Their bodies pressed together, a fragile, explosive connection through their clothes, a dance of deep need and deeper tenderness. Every sigh, every soft sound seemed to carry a lifetime of waiting. In that moment, the entire city, huddled by their radios, heard the soft, unmistakable sounds of their first kiss. Then, just as his lips moved from her mouth to the sensitive skin of her neck, a frantic producer in the master control room, alerted by a flood of stunned calls, slammed a button. The broadcast was cut, plunging thousands of listeners into shocking, absolute silence. But inside the studio, the storm had finally broken. They pulled apart slightly, breathless, resting their foreheads together in the quiet aftermath. The green glow of the audio levels, which had captured the frantic rhythm of their heartbeats, settled back into a calm, steady line. They were off the air, but for the first time they were truly connected. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright. The city washed clean. The atmosphere inside WROA, however, was anything but calm. The broadcast was the only thing anyone was talking about. Clara and Leo walked into Brenda's office side by side, a silent, united front. Brenda looked up from a blizzard of paperwork, her expression a strange cocktail of fury, awe, and sheer, unadulterated glee. "Do you have any idea," she began, her voice low, "what you two have done?" She slammed a stack of ratings projections onto the desk. "You have created the single biggest radio event in this city's history. The advertisers are in a frenzy. The network is calling. Everyone wants to know what happens next." She leaned forward, her eyes pinning them both. "I should fire you for violating about 17 FCC regulations, but the numbers, my God, the numbers," she sighed, a sound of profound surrender. "So here's the choice. We can end the show, issue a public apology, and go our separate ways. Or you can continue. No more gimmicks, no more manufactured drama, just you on your own terms." The next morning at 6 a.m, a city held its breath. The red on-air light flicked on. For a long moment there was only the soft hum of the console. Then Leo's voice, stripped of all artifice, warm and sincere. "Good morning," he began. "For a while now you've been listening to a story. Some of it was planned, some of it wasn't. We've been Vance and Croft, a performance that got a little too real. What we'd like to do from now on is just talk." He looked across the console at Clara. She offered him a small, radiant smile and leaned into her microphone. She held no script. Her hands were resting calm on the table. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice rich with a warmth no one had ever heard from her on air before. "And this is Leo. It's a beautiful morning. Let's see what the day brings." Their banter was different now. It was gentle, teasing, and deeply intimate. They still disagreed about films, about the best way to make coffee, about a new piece of public art. But the arguments were laced with affection, the easy rhythm of two people who were learning the music of each other's souls. The listeners didn't just accept the change, they embraced it. They had been fans of the drama, but they fell in love with the truth. Weeks later, the morning sun streamed into an apartment filled with the scent of coffee and old books. It was Clara's space, a sanctuary of soft light and towering shelves that Leo was only now getting to know. He was in her small kitchen, humming softly as he poured 2 mugs of coffee, completely at home. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. The comfortable silence between them was a new kind of language, one that required no words. He turned in her embrace, his hands coming up to cup her face. "Good morning," he murmured, and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss of comfort and promise, a conversation that had started in a storm and now continued in the quiet light of day. It spoke of shared futures and lazy Sunday mornings, of arguments resolved and vulnerabilities cherished. He lifted her easily into his arms, and she laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. He carried her from the kitchen into her bedroom, the sunlight following them. He laid her gently on the bed, and for a moment just looked at her, his eyes full of a tenderness that made her heart ache with happiness. As his hands began to trace the lines of her body, it was not with the frantic hunger of a first touch, but with the slow, reverent attention of a scholar memorizing a beloved, sacred text. It was a quiet, spiritual act of union, a final confirmation that the love their listeners had only heard was now the solid, breathing foundation of their lives. And so, in the quiet hum of a city waking up, they found their true frequency, not in the sound waves sent out to thousands, but in the gentle whisper shared between two hearts, finally, perfectly in tune. The Katahdin Promise. The rain had been a constant companion for 3 days, a merciless drumming beat against the hood of Alara's jacket. It wasn't the gentle, life-giving rain of poems, but a cold, aggressive torrent that turned the world to a monochrome blur of grey sky and brown mud. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd stood on Springer Mountain, full of a desperate manufactured hope that to the weight of miles of wilderness could somehow rearrange the scattered pieces of her life. Almost a year ago she'd been in a cap and gown, the fabric itching against her neck, a fixed smile plastered on her face as relatives asked the same suffocating question. So, what's the plan? The plan. As if life were a blueprint you were handed with your diploma. Her friends had plans, consulting jobs, grad school, internships that blossomed into careers. Alara had a degree in literature and a hollow feeling in her chest. So she'd concocted an escape she'd framed as a plan, a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. It sounded brave, adventurous. It sounded like anything other than what it was, running away. She thought the trail would provide answers, that the rhythm of walking would pound clarity into her bones. Instead, it had only amplified the silence inside her, a vast emptiness that echoed the endless green tunnel of trees. A slick root, disguised by a layer of decaying leaves, caught her boot, sending her crashing down. Her knee slammed into a rock, and the impact sent a sickening jolt up her leg. She didn't even cry out. She just lay there, face half pressed into the mud, as the cold seeped through her waterproof layers, which had long ago surrendered. Every muscle already screaming from the relentless climbs and descents of the southern Appalachians now throbbed with a fresh wave of agony. "What am I even doing out here?" she whispered, the words swallowed by the storm. Her own voice sounded foreign, thin. "Everyone else has a 5-year plan. I don't even have a 5-minute plan, just mud. And this cold that goes all the way to your bones. Maybe I'm just not built for this. Maybe I'm not built for anything." Tears finally came, hot and pointless against her rain-chilled skin. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and heavy, and leaned her back against the rough bark of an oak. The sucking sound of her boots pulling free from the mud was a sound of defeat. This wasn't a journey of self-discovery. It was a slow, painful surrender to the elements. With trembling, numb fingers, she fumbled inside her pack for her satellite messenger. She'd programmed a message before she left. "I'm done, come get me." It was for emergencies, but this felt like one, an emergency of the soul. Her thumb hovered over the send button. The thought of the subsequent phone calls, the mixture of relief and disappointment in her parents' voices, the quiet "I told you so" from her friends. It was a humiliation she could barely stomach. But the alternative, Another day, another week of the misery felt impossible. Her eyes fell to the trail guide tucked into the mesh pocket of her pack. The pages were swollen and warped from the damp, the ink slightly blurred. She pulled it out, her movements clumsy. Her finger traced the red line of the trail, past her current miserable position. Standing Bear Farm, the text read. A legendary hostel, a sanctuary. She'd read about it in the shelter legs, notes from hikers ahead of her praising its warmth, its ramshackle charm, its almost mythical status as a place to heal. It was just a few more miles. A deal. She made a deal with the part of herself that hadn't completely given up. She would get to Standing Bear Farm. She would get warm. She would have one last night in the strange transient community of the trail, and then, in the morning, she would quit. With that fragile pack, she pushed herself away from the tree, ignoring the protest of her bruised knee, and took one more squelching step north. Alara stumbled into Standing Bear Farm like a refugee seeking asylum. It wasn't a picturesque lodge, it was a chaotic, beautiful jumble of weathered wood buildings, prayer flags, and smiling bearded faces that all seemed to understand the exact kind of hell she'd just walked through. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and something wonderfully, unbelievably like hope. Someone pointed her toward an open bunk in the main hostel, and she dropped her heavy soaked pack with a thud that felt final. The shower was a miracle. For 20 minutes she stood under the stream of hot water, letting it wash away not just the grime of the trail, but the layers of despair that had clung to her like a second skin. She watched the mud swirl down the drain, a symbolic release of the Tennessee drownout. When she finally emerged, skin pink and pruned, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Dressed in her last set of clean, dry clothes, a pair of soft leggings and a worn-out t-shirt, she felt almost human again. Dusk was settling, and a communal fire was crackling in a large stone pit outside. Drawn by a sound that cut through the murmur of hiker chatter, she walked toward it. It was the sound of an acoustic guitar, its notes rich and clear in the cool evening air, accompanied by a voice that was pure, soulful folk. It was a sound of melancholic beauty, a ballad of lost paths and hard-won resilience. She saw him then, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. He was leaning against a porch post, bathed in the fire's golden glow, eyes closed as he sang. He had a strong jawline softened by a few days of stubble, and dark, wavy hair that fell across his forehead. But it was the raw, unguarded emotion in his voice that captured her, holding her motionless on a nearby bench. The song's lyrics spoke of a fastball that had lost its fear, of walking a new baseline, of trading a manicured field for a wild, untamed path. It felt like he was singing her own story, a story she didn't even have the words for yet. He strummed the final resonant chord, letting it hang in the air for a perfect, still moment. Then his eyes opened, and they found hers across the dancing flames. It wasn't a glance, it was a collision. The chatter of the other hikers, the crackle of the fire, the chirping of the crickets, it all faded into a muted hum. In his dark, intense eyes, she saw a flicker of the same weariness, the same searching that she felt in her own soul. For a second, she wasn't a quitter covered in mud. She was just seen. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes. He shifted, his posture relaxing as the spell broke. The sounds of the evening rushed back in. "Hey, pretty little lady," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was even better up close. "What's your name?" The question was so simple, yet her mind went completely blank. It was the kind of eye contact that makes you forget your own name. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Elora," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still holding hers. "Liam? Glad you made it, Elora." He said her name as if it were a song he was just learning to play, and in that moment, Huddled in the warmth of a stranger's music and an even stranger's smile, Ilara's carefully constructed plan to quit began to unravel. The next morning, Ilara found Liam nursing a cup of coffee by the cold fire pit. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm. Her plan had been to ask for a shuttle into the nearest town. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Which way are you headed?" "North," he said, a simple answer that felt like an invitation. Always north. They decided to hike together for a day. That day bled into a week, and soon the idea of hiking without him felt as foreign as the life she'd left behind. They fell into a rhythm, his long athletic strides pushing her, her thoughtful pace forcing him to notice the small wonders of the trail he'd been rushing past. Virginia unfolded before them, a seemingly endless stretch of green that had earned the name the Virginia Blues from countless hikers before them. But for Ilara, it was anything but blue. It was the landscape of their beginning. The miles were filled with stories. He taught her how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to listen for the rustle of a black bear in the undergrowth. She taught him the names of the wildflowers that dotted the trailside: trillium, lady slipper, bloodroot. The trail became their confessional. Under the vast, starry skies at trail shelters, their voices low murmurs in the quiet of the woods, they unwrapped their pasts for each other. Liam spoke of the crushing pressure of being a top baseball prospect, the boy with the $1 million arm. He described the sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder that ended it all, and the deeper pain of losing the only identity he'd ever known. "The scout said I had $1 million arm," he said one night, his voice laced with old grief. "Turns out it only takes one bad throw to make it worthless." "Maybe its worth isn't about throwing a ball," Ilara replied softly, her fingers tracing the constellations above them. "Maybe it's about being strong enough to hold a guitar, or my hand when I'm about to slip." She in turn spoke of her own quiet fears, the suffocating weight of an unwritten future, the feeling of being an imposter among her high-achieving peers. With Liam the words came easily, the shame lifting with each confession. He didn't offer solutions, he just listened, his presence a steady, comforting anchor. One sweltering afternoon they followed the sound of rushing water off trail and discovered a hidden swimming hole, a perfect emerald pool fed by a small waterfall. A mischievous look passed between them, a silent dare. Moments later their clothes were in piles on the sun-warmed rocks, and they were plunging into the shockingly cold water. Their gasps turned to laughter, a pure, unburdened sound that echoed off the rock walls. Under the water his hand brushed against hers as they treaded water, and the jolt was more electrifying than the cold. In that sun-dappled sanctuary, they were just two people, free from their pasts, alive in the moment. Other hikers began to notice the easy orbit they had around each other. They were no longer just Ilara and Liam. They were a unit. It was a grizzled, older hiker named Pops who gave them their trail names. Liam for his legendary fastball and the easy way he could slide a story into any conversation became Mula. Ilara for her quiet, determined search for direction became Compass's Rose. The names stuck, a new identity forged together on the trail. They were Slider and Compass Rose, a partnership growing closer with every mile, the slow burn of their connection warming them more than any campfire. The White Mountains of New Hampshire were a different beast entirely. The trail, which had been a rugged but manageable path, transformed into a series of near-vertical rock scrambles that demanded hands as well as feet. The climbs were longer, the descents more treacherous, and the weather, they were warned, was a fickle god. They had been hiking above the tree line for an hour, the world a breathtaking panorama of granite and sky when the change came. It started subtly. The brilliant blue sky hazed over, and a cool breeze whispered across the exposed ridge. Within minutes, the whisper became a howl. and dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the western peaks, racing toward them with unnatural speed. The temperature plummeted. Elara zipped her fleece to her chin, her earlier awe turning to a knot of anxiety in her stomach. "We need to get lower," Liam's voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the rising wind. "Now!" But there was nowhere to go. They were on a narrow spine of rock, a stone walkway in the sky. Then came the first flash of lightning, a jagged tear in the dark clouds, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the mountain itself was splitting apart. Panic seized Elara. Her breath caught in her throat, her legs freezing in place. Liam's hand found hers, his grip strong and sure. The casual, easygoing hiker was gone, replaced by the focused athlete he used to be. His eyes scanned the terrain, assessing, calculating. "This way!" he yelled over the wind, pulling her along. He led them, half scrambling, half sliding, off the main ridge, toward a jumble of massive boulders. Just as the first icy pellets of hail began to sting their faces, he found it. A deep alcove, a small cave formed by two house-sized rocks leaning against each other. He pushed her inside and followed, their bodies pressed together in the cramped space as the full fury of the storm broke around them. Wind shrieked, thunder crashed, and lightning illuminated their tiny sanctuary in stark, strobing flashes. Shivering, soaked and breathless, they huddled together, sharing body heat. The sheer terror of the last few minutes had stripped away every last pretense, every unspoken word that had lingered between them for months. He wrapped his arms around her, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm's rage. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her cheek. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression raw, his eyes dark with an emotion that made her heart ache. "I wasn't scared of the lightning," he said, his voice husky and low. "I was scared of losing you." His inner thought was a revelation. They say lightning never strikes the same place twice. They're wrong. It struck me the moment I saw her, and it was striking me again right now. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, his lips were on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, fueled by months of unspoken feelings and the raw adrenaline of their survival. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and fear and a profound, overwhelming relief. She kissed him back with all the certainty she'd been searching for since she'd first set foot on the trail, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer. In the heart of the storm, sheltered by ancient rock, they finally found their own safe harbour. The final climb to Katahdin began in the pre-dawn darkness, the beams of their headlamps cutting sharp cones of light through the cold, pine-scented air. They moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, a single unit against the immense challenge of Maine's greatest mountain. The trail was less a path than a puzzle of giant granite boulders, requiring them to hoist each other up, their movements a synchronized dance they had perfected over 2,000 miles. They were no longer two lost people searching for a way forward. They were a team, each the other's anchor and guide. As they cleared the tree line, the first hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon in pale shades of lavender and rose. The wind was a sharp, biting force, but they barely noticed, their focus entirely on the summit that loomed above them. When they finally pulled themselves over the last boulder and saw the iconic weathered sign, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled Elara's knees washed over them. Katahdin. Northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. They had made it. They touched the rough carved wood of the sign together, their fingers intertwining. A few other hikers huddled against the rocks cheered for them, their voices thin in the vast emptiness. "Congratulations, Slider and Compass Rose," one shouted, solidifying the identity they had built together. They were the Nobo couple, a small legend in the transient world of the trail. The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the world below with a spectacular golden light. They stood on the roof of Maine, looking out at an endless sea of mountains and lakes, and then they looked at each other. Liam's eyes were full of a love so deep and certain it took Alara's breath away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small smooth stone worn into the shape of a heart by some ancient river. He pressed it into her palm. "I came out here to figure out what to do without baseball," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Turns out the answer wasn't a what, it was a who. My dream isn't about pitching anymore, Rose, it's about writing songs and seeing where this path leads, as long as you're on it with me." Tears streamed down Alara's face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked from the stone in her hand to the man in front of her, and for the first time in her life, her future felt absolutely clear. She hadn't needed to find a specific career or a perfectly mapped out plan. She'd needed to find her direction, her true north. "I came here to get away from the world," she whispered, her voice catching. "I ended up finding mine." And as the sun fully illuminated the wild, beautiful world below them, he kissed her. It was a kiss unlike the desperate one in the storm. This one was slow and deep and full of the quiet certainty of a sunrise. It was a kiss that held the memory of every mile, every struggle, and every shared laugh. It was the Katahdin Promise. The Appalachian Trail doesn't give you the answers you think you're looking for. It just gives you the miles, the silence, and the strength to finally ask the right questions. And if you're lucky, it gives you the person you're meant to ask them with for the rest of your life. Embers of Wildflower Hill. The summer of 1895 arrived in the valley like a whispered promise. It settled over Wildflower Hill Farm in waves of golden light that poured through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dance of dust motes in the air. For me, Cora May, each morning was a replica of the last, a litany of chores set to the rhythm of birdsong and the distant Sunday morning chime of church bells from the town I could see but rarely visited. I was a creature of routine, my world contained by the farm's fences and the sharp, ever-present voice of my guardian, Mrs. Whitmore. "Cora, the bread will burn if you stand there daydreaming," she called from the porch, her voice cutting through the gentle morning symphony like a scythe through wheat. A girl who just turned 18 ought to have more sense than a goose. I flinched, turning from the window to the scent of yeast and warmth. My life was a series of small, contained tasks, kneading dough, churning butter, mending linens. It was a safe life, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. Mrs. Whitmore had taken me in from the county orphanage. It was the place where foundlings like me, left as infants on the church steps, waited for a life to begin. She chose me when I was 5, and she never let me forget that my existence was her act of charity, a debt I was meant to repay with silent obedience. My dreams were an indulgence we couldn't afford. That morning, however, the routine was broken. As I carried a pail of fresh milk toward the cool of the root cellar, a horse and wagon I didn't recognize crested the hill. It was driven by a man whose clothes were not of our valley. He wore a crisp, light-coloured suit, a city hat perched on his head, and his posture was one of easy confidence that seemed alien against the backdrop of our weathered barns and sprawling fields. He pulled his horse to a gentle stop near the porch, his eyes scanning the property with a thoughtful curiosity I'd never seen before. Men here looked at the land for what it could yield: corn, hay, potatoes. This man looked at it as if he were listening to a secret it was telling. He tipped his hat toward Mrs. Whitmore, who stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of suspicion. "Good morning, madame. My name is Julian Ashford. I'm a surveyor from Boston, looking for the Ashford property line." Mrs. Whitmore's expression sharpened, her eyes narrowing on his face. "Ashford, you say? It's a bold thing, a city Ashford coming back to look at the land your family abandoned. What business could you have here now?" The gentle smile on his face tightened slightly, but he held her gaze. "It remains my family's land, madam, and my business is to survey it. I've been tasked with mapping what was left behind." It was then that he saw me, standing frozen halfway to the cellar, the milk pail heavy in my hands. His gaze was direct, yet kind. It wasn't the appraising look of the farmhands or the dismissive glance of the town gentry. It was a look of genuine, quiet observation. In that moment, a nervous tremor ran through me, and my grip on the pail handle slipped. The pail clattered to the dirt, sending a cascade of white milk and tin cups scattering across the yard. A hot flush of shame burned my cheeks. "Clumsy girl," Mrs. Whitmore snapped, but Julian was already off his wagon before the words had fully landed. He knelt, not minding the dirt on his fine trousers, and began gathering the cups. His hands were long and elegant, yet smudged with what looked like ink stains around the fingers. "It happens to the best of us," he said, his voice low and meant only for me. He handed me the cups, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was a spark against the cool morning air. "Your hands," he observed softly, looking at my trembling fingers, "shake like autumn leaves." I couldn't find my voice to answer. I could only stare at the ink stains, the kindness in his eyes, at this man who had stepped out of another world and into the middle of my own. Later that evening, long after the supper dishes were cleaned and Mrs. Whitmore was asleep, I sat at my small bedroom window. A single lamp burned in the distance, a point of gold against the deepening indigo of the hills. It was him. Julian had set up his camp near the edge of the Ashford land. I could see his silhouette against the lamplight as he bent over a large drawing board, a pencil moving deftly in his hand. He wasn't conquering the land, he was learning its language, translating its contours onto paper. I watched for what felt like hours. The world outside my window suddenly vast and filled with a thrilling, terrifying possibility. I'd never seen a man who looked at the world as if it was something beautiful to be preserved rather than conquered. And as he worked under the silent watch of the stars, I felt a part of myself, a part I hadn't even known was dormant, begin to stir and awaken. The valley was the same, but for the first time I felt the promise of a different view. The days that followed were filled with a secret current of anticipation. I performed my chores with a new, quiet energy, my senses tuned to the distant sound of Julian's work, the metallic clink of his surveying equipment, the soft thud of a wooden stake being driven into the earth. I found excuses to be outdoors, my eyes always drifting toward the overgrown fields that separated our farm from the forgotten Ashford land. It was during one of these stolen moments, while picking a bunch of wild Queen Anne's lace near the crumbling stone wall of the old mill, that he found me. I was so lost in thought, tracing the delicate web-like pattern of a flower, that I didn't hear him approach. "They look like constellations, don't they?" His voice startled me, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Julian stood there, holding not a tool, but a sketchbook. A gentle smile played on his lips, each one a tiny galaxy. I clutched the wildflowers to my chest. I never thought of it that way. "That's the secret to everything," he said, taking a step closer. "Perspective. The same view can look entirely different depending on where you stand." He opened his sketchbook, and my breath caught. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed drawings, the gnarled trunk of an oak tree, the precise architecture of a dragonfly's wing, the sweep of the valley as seen from the hill. And there, on a fresh page, was a light sketch of the old mill, its stones rendered with a loving, meticulous hand. "You make things beautiful," I whispered, mesmerized. "I don't make them beautiful," he corrected gently. "I just try to see the beauty that's already there." He gestured to the flower in my hand. "May I?" He took out a graphite pencil and turned to a new page in his book. "Let me show you." He guided me to sit on the sun-warmed stone wall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the sound of water trickling over stones in the nearby creek. He began to sketch the Queen Anne's lace, explaining the way the light fell, the importance of shadow, the fine art of seeing. To show me a curve, he placed the pencil in my hand and gently enclosed his fingers over mine, guiding my knuckles. A tremor went through me at the contact, the warmth of his skin, the slight pressure of his hand, the shared purpose of creating a line on paper. It was the most intimate touch I had ever known. In that dappled, sunlit sanctuary, walls began to crumble. Not just the stone ones around us, but the ones I had built around my heart. Emboldened by his kindness, I confessed a secret I had guarded for years. "I can read," I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Mrs. Whitmore thinks it's a waste of time for a girl. She doesn't know." Julian's eyes lit up with a profound respect that felt more nourishing than any praise I'd ever received. He didn't pity me, he celebrated me. The next afternoon he returned to our spot by the mill. He didn't bring his sketchbook. He brought a small leather-bound book. The gold lettering on the spine read, "The Poetical Works of John Keats." He opened it to a page marked with a pressed violet. "Do you know what beauty is, Cora?" he asked, his voice soft as he read the lines aloud. His voice gave the words a life I'd never imagined. "Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know." He looked up at me, his gaze intense. "It isn't just about pretty things. It's about honesty, sincerity, courage. Beauty is courage made visible." He left the book with me. That night I read Keats by candlelight, the scent of crushed wildflower petals rising from the pages. His poem spoke of nightingales and Grecian urns, of love and loss so profound it made my chest ache. But it was Julian's words that echoed in my mind, courage made visible. With each passing day in our hidden garden of possibility, I felt that courage taking root inside me. He was teaching me about perspective, not just in drawing, but in life. He saw the world as a place of wonder, and when he looked at me, I started to believe I could be a part of it. The warmth of his shoulder brushing against mine as we looked at his sketches, the shared silence broken only by the creek's murmur, the secret knowledge of the book hidden beneath my mattress, these were the seeds of a new world. I had lived in this valley all my life, surrounded by its rolling hills and familiar seasons, but as I told him one late afternoon, my voice trembling with the truth of it, "I've never really seen it until you showed me how to look." The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all day, but as twilight began to bleed across the horizon, a bruised purple stain appeared in the west. The air grew heavy and still, the birds falling silent. I was helping Julian measure the foundation of the old Ashford house, holding one end of his long measuring tape, when the first fat drop of rain hit my cheek, then another, and another. Within moments, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour, cold and violent, swept across the hills. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. "The barn!" Julian shouted over the roar, grabbing my hand and his satchel of drawings. We ran, slipping on the wet grass, the rain plastering my thin, cotton dress to my skin and his hair to his forehead. We stumbled into the cavernous, hay-scented darkness of the old mill barn just as another peal of thunder rolled through the valley like the footfalls of a giant. The rain hammered on the wooden roof, a deafening, relentless drumbeat. Inside, the world shrank to just the two of us, surrounded by shadows and the smell of old wood, dry hay, and the approaching storm. A flash of lightning illuminated the space, freezing us for a second in a stark silver tableau, his hand still holding mine, our chests heaving from the run. He let go of my hand, but the warmth lingered. He moved to the large barn doors, peering out at the tempest. "It looks like we'll be here a while." The storm outside seemed to mirror the one gathering inside me. In the close, charged atmosphere of the barn, all pretense fell away. We were no longer surveyor and farm girl, teacher and student. We were just a man and a woman sheltered from the same storm. He turned from the door, his face cast in shadow. "I've been drawing other people's dreams for so long, I forgot I had my own," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the echoing space. He told me of his life in Boston, of a father who saw architecture as a business of status and wealth, not art. He was meant to design opulent mansions for men he didn't respect, to marry a woman chosen for her family's connections, to live a life that was a perfect, beautiful blueprint of someone else's desires. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking a door in my own heart. I found myself telling him things I had never spoken aloud, of the cold loneliness of the orphanage, of the gnawing fear of being unwanted that had been my constant companion. "Sometimes I feel invisible," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper, "like a ghost in my own life." He moved closer, his expression achingly tender in the gloom. "You are the least invisible person I have ever met, Cora." Another flash of lightning lit his feet, and in that split second, I saw the raw emotion there, a longing that mirrored my own. He raised his hand, his fingers gently brushing a rain-soaked strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was electric. The thunder outside seemed to beat in time with my own heart. He leaned in and the world stopped. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like the chaste fantasies I might have entertained. It was tender and desperate, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of rain and salt, the rain on his skin and the single tear that escaped my eye and traced a path down my face. The kiss deepened, breaking a dam inside me. All the yearning, all the unspoken hopes, all the feelings I had no names for rushed to the surface in a wave of consuming heat. He pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me, holding me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. In the heart of the storm, I felt utterly, completely safe and yet more thrillingly endangered than I had ever been. He broke the kiss only to press his lips to my neck, his breath hot against my rain-cooled skin. My head fell back, a silent surrender to the sensations he was awakening. With a groan that seemed pulled from his very soul, he guided me backward and we sank down into a pile of soft, sweet-smelling hay. The rustle of it was a whisper joining the drumming of the rain on the roof. His hands, the same hands that could render the world with such delicate precision on paper, were now learning the lines of my body with a desperate, wonderful urgency. He unlaced the bodice of my dress, his fingers fumbling slightly, a sign of a passion that overrode his usual grace. The cool air hit my skin as he peeled away the damp cotton, his gaze following the path of his hands. There was no shame in his eyes, only a profound, breathtaking reverence that made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life. He lowered his head, his lips tracing a fiery path along my collarbone, down into the valley between my breasts. I gasped, my fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. This was desire. This was a choice. Each touch was a question he was asking, and my every shuddering breath was an answer. My own hands grew bold, exploring the hard planes of his back, the surprising strength in his shoulders. I helped him with the buttons of his shirt, my fingers brushing against the solid warmth of his chest. When our skin met, it was like lightning, a jolt of pure feeling that arced between us. He was real, solid, and warm beneath my hands. When our bodies finally joined, it was a moment of absolute breathtaking clarity. Sharp gasp of pain and pleasure left my lips, a sound that was instantly swallowed by his kiss. He held himself still above me, his eyes locked on mine, waiting. In that gaze I gave him my trust, and he met it with a tenderness that shattered me. He moved, slowly at first, a rhythm that matched the steady, insistent rain outside. a rhythm that was building a new world inside the forgotten barn. It was not a surrender, but a claiming of myself, of him, of this one perfect stolen moment in time where we were the only two souls in existence. The hay pricked my skin, the thunder rolled in the distance, and the only thing I could feel was him, a glorious, undeniable presence that filled all my senses. Later, as we lay tangled in limbs and hay, the storm outside having softened to a steady rhythmic drumming, I traced the line of his jaw. My voice, when I found it, was a raw whisper against his chest. You make me feel like I exist. He gathered me closer, his arm a solid weight of possession and protection around me. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. You make me feel like I'm finally building something for myself. Just then, a faint, sharp sound cut through the rain. Cora! Cora! Where are you? It was Mrs. Whitmore's voice, a cold blade of reality slicing through our sanctuary. The spell was broken. I understood then that love was not gentle. It was a wildfire that consumed everything you thought you knew about yourself, leaving you raw and exposed and utterly transformed in its wake. And as I gathered my clothes in the shadows, the scent of hay and rain and him clinging to my skin, I knew that I could never go back to the girl I was before the storm. The world after the storm felt muted, holding its breath. For 3 days, a profound silence settled over Wildflower Hill. Julian was gone. His camp was still there, a lonely canvas tent by the woods, but he did not appear at our garden by the mill, nor did his lamp burn late into the night. An agonizing knot of fear and doubt tightened in my chest. The memory of the barn, the thunder, his touch, his whispered confessions felt like a fever dream. Had I imagined it all? On the evening of the 3rd day, my anxiety became unbearable. After Mrs. Whitmore had retired, her snores a rhythmic counterpoint to my frantic heartbeat, I slipped out of the house. A sliver of moon offered just enough light to guide my path toward his camp. My bare feet were silent on the damp earth. I saw him as I cleared the tree line. He was packing. His surveying tools were already boxed, his drawing board wrapped in oilcloth. He was folding his tent with a grim mechanical efficiency. My heart plummeted. He was leaving. Julian? My voice was a fragile thing in the vast quiet. He froze, his back to me. When he finally turned, his face was a portrait of anguish. He looked pale, haunted. Cora, you shouldn't be here. You're leaving, I stated, the words tasting like ash. Without a word. I had to go to town, he said, his voice strained. There was a telegram. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He reached for his coat, which lay draped over a crate, and as he lifted it, a single white envelope fluttered to the ground. Neither of us moved for a second. It lay there between us, stark against the dark grass. I bent and picked it up. My fingers recognized the expensive, crisp paper. It wasn't addressed to him. It was an invitation. My eyes scanned the elegant, looping script, and the words seemed to burn themselves into my mind. Mr. and Mrs. Alistair Thornfield request the pleasure of your company to celebrate the engagement of their daughter, Miss Margaret Thornfield and Mr. Julian Ashford. The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. The world tilted, the trees swaying as if they would fall. I looked from the pristine white card to his tormented face, and a cold, sharp rage I had never known began to smoulder within me. Was I just another landscape for you to survey and abandon? I asked, my voice trembling with a fury that was utterly new to me. I held up the invitation. Was this part of your study? The naive farm girl? Another pretty sketch to add to your collection? No, Cora, no, it's not like that, he said, stepping toward me, his hands outstretched. Please, let me explain. Explain this. I thrust the invitation at him. The paper tore slightly in my grip. His desperation was palpable, his words tumbling out in a torrent of misery. "It's an arrangement. My family's. It was made years ago. My father's business is failing. Her family is wealthy. It's a merger, not a marriage. It's about obligation and debt. It has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how I feel about you." "How you feel about me?" I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You feel so much that you are going to disappear without a trace?" "I didn't know what to do," he cried, his voice cracking. "I came back from town today to pack my things and tell you, I swear it, this life, this engagement, it's a prison. You, Cora, you are the only real thing in it. I would give up everything for you, but I have nothing to give. My name, my inheritance, it's all tied to this." His words, meant to be a comfort, were a confirmation of the terrible truth. I was his secret, his escape, the wildflower he could appreciate in a hidden garden, but could never wear on his lapel in the drawing rooms of Boston. The storm in the barn was our sanctuary, but it was also our cage, a place outside of his real life. I stood there, the torn invitation clutched in my hand, the single candle in my distant bedroom window the only warm light in a world that had gone cold. He was trapped, yes, but he was asking me to be trapped with him, to accept the stolen moments, the hidden affections, the life lived in the shadows of his obligations. And in that moment of devastating clarity, I realized the choice wasn't his to make alone. It was mine. The girl who felt invisible was gone. The woman standing before him would not be someone's secret. She would not trade one cage for another, no matter how beautifully gilded. "Love without courage is just another cage, Julian," I said, my voice steady now with a resolve forged in the fire of this betrayal. "And I've lived in enough cages for one lifetime." I dropped the torn letter at his feet, turned, and walked back toward the farmhouse, not looking back. I didn't hear him call my name. I heard only the sound of my own ragged breathing, and the distant lonely sound of his horse being hitched to his wagon, preparing to depart. A week passed. The air turned crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. The vibrant greens of Wildflower Hill began to be tinged with strokes of gold and rust, the world changing its colours around me. I changed with it. The searing pain of Julian's departure cooled into a hard, clear resolve. I did not weep. Instead, I read. I devoured the book of Keats, not for the romance, but for the strength I found in its pages. I helped Mrs. Whitmore with the chores, my movements sure and steady, my silence no longer one of meekness, but of contemplation. During that week, I did something I had never dared to do. I hitched our old mare to the cart and drove myself into town. I walked into the county schoolhouse and spoke to the headmistress, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Gable. I told her I could read and write, that I knew my numbers, and that I wanted to learn how to teach. I showed her my penmanship. She looked at me over her spectacles, her gaze sharp and appraising. She saw not a charity case, but a mind hungry for purpose. She offered me a position, assisting her, with the chance to become a teacher in the small school in the next county come spring. It wasn't a grand life, but it would be my own. I returned to the farm feeling a sense of ownership over my own destiny for the first time. I had a plan that did not involve waiting for a man to choose me. I was choosing myself. Then at dawn on the 8th day, as the morning mist was lifting from the valley like a slow-rising curtain, I saw a figure walking up the path. It was Julian. He was on foot, his fine city clothes replaced by simple, sturdy trousers and a worn shirt. He carried no surveying equipment, no sketchbooks. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He didn't come to the farmhouse. He went to our garden by the old mill, as if he knew that was where he might find me. And he was right. I was already there, waiting. I had been drawn there by some instinct, a feeling that our story was not yet finished. He stopped a few feet from me, his hands empty at his sides. "I broke the engagement," he said. his voice quiet but firm. "I spoke to my father. I told him I would not be a part of the arrangement. He disowned me. I have forfeited my inheritance, my position, everything." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "I came to ask you to come to Boston with me, Cora. I have nothing but my hands and my heart to offer you. I can find work. I can draw, I can build. We would have nothing, but we would have each other. A year ago, a week ago, his words would have been a rescue, a dream come true, but I was not the same girl. I smiled, a small, sad but powerful smile. "I cannot go to Boston as the woman you support, Julian," I said, and I saw a flash of pain in his eyes before I continued, "but I will go as your partner." I told him about my meeting with Mrs. Gable, about the teaching position, about the life I had begun to build for myself in the ashes of my heartbreak. "I have my own future now," I explained, "my own work to do." Understanding dawned on his face, replaced by a look of profound, breathtaking admiration. This was the perspective he had taught me to see. He wasn't saving me. We were meeting as equals. Two people who had chosen to dismantle their old lives to build a new one. "Then we shall go together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You will teach, and I will build. We will make our own fortune, our own home." He stepped forward and took my hands in his. His touch was no longer just a spark of desire. It was a steady, grounding force. "Let me come with you." And so we chose each other, not out of dependency or desperation, but out of a shared vision for a life built on courage. The next morning we stood on the platform at the train station. I carried a small travelling bag containing a change of clothes, the Book of Keats, and a single pressed wildflower from our garden. From the farmhouse window on the hill, I could just make out the silhouette of Mrs. Whitmore watching us go. I felt not anger, but a strange sort of pity for her, for a life lived within such rigid fences. As the train pulled away with a great hiss of steam and a hopeful whistle, I pressed my face to the window and watched Wildflower Hill grow smaller in the distance. The girl who had never dared to dream beyond the next sunrise was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who had learned that the greatest act of love is not surrendering yourself to another, but becoming fully yourself, and then choosing to share that self with someone brave enough to do the same. Julian's hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. It felt not like a rescue, but like a promise, that we would build our own garden wherever we planted ourselves and tend it together. And as the train carried us toward an uncertain future, the morning light pouring in, I knew we were finally heading home. When the corn turns gold. The Nebraska air in late April carried the scent of possibility. It smelled of damp, overturned earth, of lilac bushes teasing their first buds, and of the clean, crisp promise of a spring that had finally wrestled winter into submission. 17-year-old Hannah Callahan hummed a tuneless melody, her fingers nimble as she pinned her father's work shirts to the clothesline. The wind, a constant companion on the plains, billowed the fabric like a ship's sails, and with each gust the faint, reassuring rumble of a tractor reached her from the neighbouring farm. Eli's tractor. It was the background music to her entire life, a steady thrumming that meant the world was turning as it should. She smiled, her thoughts drifting from the chores at hand to the dress hanging in her closet. A cascade of periwinkle chiffon she'd found at a thrift store and altered with her mother's help. Prom was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks until she and Ryan would step into the brightly decorated community centre, leaving their small-town lives behind for one magical night. Ryan, with his easy smile and quarterback confidence, was her ticket to the kind of senior year memories she'd seen in movies, the kind she craved with a fierce teenage ache. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jeans. She wiped a damp hand on her thigh before answering, her smile widening when she saw his name. "Hey, you." "Hannah." "Hey." Ryan's voice wasn't warm and teasing like usual. It was flat, distant, like a call coming from across an ocean, not from the next town over. "Listen, I need to tell you something about prom." A knot of ice formed in Hannah's stomach. The gentle breeze suddenly felt sharp, invasive. "Okay." There was a pause, filled with the crackle of static and the sound of him clearing his throat. "I'm taking Jessica instead. We've just been talking a lot, and it just makes more sense." The world tilted on its axis. Jessica. Jessica Riley, whose locker was 3 down from hers, whose laughter always seemed a little too loud in the hallways. The words didn't compute, they just collided. Makes more sense. The phrase was a clinical blade severing the future she had so carefully constructed in her mind. Her fingers went slack. Denim shirt, still damp, slipped from the line and fell into the patch of dirt below. "Hannah, are you there?" "Why?" The word was a ghost, barely audible over the sudden silence of the wind chimes on the porch, which had ceased their gentle song. It's what's happening, okay? I'm sorry." He wasn't sorry. His tone was one of inconvenience, of a task being checked off a list. Hannah didn't say goodbye. She just ended the call, her thumb pressing the screen with a trembling finality. She stared at the fallen shirt, a dark blue blot against the brown earth. How do you prepare for the ground to disappear beneath your feet? For a moment, she felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. Then came the heat, a flush of humiliation that climbed her neck and burned her cheeks. Every conversation in the school hallway, every shared glance over lunch, every whispered plan for their future, it all replayed in her mind, now tainted with fraud. She unpinned the rest of the laundry with robotic movements, her hand shaking so badly she dropped 2 more clothespins. She didn't bother to pick them up. Inside the house, the familiar scent of her mother's baking was suffocating. She couldn't face the questions in her mother's eyes. She slipped out the back door and ran, not toward the house but toward the cavernous refuge of the barn. The heavy wooden door groaned open and slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the vast dusty space. Hannah climbed the ladder to the hayloft, her sanctuary since she was a little girl. It was where she'd hidden from thunderstorms and creed over scraped knees. Now it was where she would hide from a broken heart. The golden hour light of late afternoon streamed through the high, dirty window, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the sweet, earthy smell of old hay and dry wood. She collapsed onto a bale, the rough straw scratching her arms, and finally let the tears come. They were hot and silent, carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. Outside the world went on. A dog barked, a car passed on the gravel road. And then a new sound, or rather the absence of one. The steady, comforting rumble of Eli's tractor had gone silent. The day was over. For Eli, it was just the end of another day of work. For Hannah, it felt like the end of everything. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and wept as the last of the golden light faded to a bruised, lonely purple. 2 days later, the sky opened up. A cold spring rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the farm's dirt lanes into muddy rivers and drumming a sombre, hypnotic rhythm on the tin roof of the Parker family barn. Hannah and her father had just finished delivering a load of feed, and she'd lingered, watching the storm from the shelter of the massive doorway, not yet ready to face the quiet sympathy waiting for her at home. The news about Ryan and Jessica had spread through the school's social ecosystem like wildfire, and she felt as though she were wearing her heartbreak like a scarlet letter. The scent of rain-soaked earth mingled with the sweet, heavy smell of hay and livestock. A gust of wind drove a fine mist into her face, and she shivered, hugging her thin cardigan tighter. "You'll catch your death out here." The voice made her jump. Eli Parker emerged from the gloom of a nearby stall, wiping his hands on a rag. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broadened by years of farm work. His flannel shirt was worn soft at the elbows, and his hair was a perpetual mess of dusty blonde curls. He'd always just been Eli, the quiet boy next door, a fixture like the old oak tree that marked the property line between their farms. "Just watching the rain," she mumbled, looking away. He didn't press, he just stood beside her, his presence surprisingly solid. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but filled with the steady drumming of the rain. Barn cats, sleek and confident, wound around their ankles, purring with a rumbling contentment that Hannah envied. "Heard about Ryan," Eli said finally, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at the downpour. "He's an idiot." It was simple, direct, and more comforting than any of the pitying looks she'd received from her friends. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Yeah, he is." He shrugged out of his flannel jacket. "Here, you're shivering." Before she could protest, he draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and ridiculously large on her, smelling of sawdust, soap, and something that was uniquely Eli. The warmth seeped into her skin, a small shield against the chill inside and out. "Thanks," she whispered, pulling it closer. They stood like that for another minute, watching the storm. Eli's awkwardness was a kind of gentle armour. He fidgeted with the rag in his hands, his gaze shifting from the rain to the barn rafters and back again. "I know it's probably stupid," he began, his words hesitant, "and it's none of my business, but you shouldn't miss our prom because Ryan's an idiot." Hannah's breath caught. She turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time in what felt like years. His eyes, a shade of blue that mirrored the summer sky, were fixed on her with a startling sincerity. "What are you saying, Eli?" He swallowed, a flicker of nerves crossing his face. I don't do dances. They terrify me, to be honest. All those people," he gestured vaguely with the rag, "but you shouldn't have to stay home. You shouldn't have to watch from the sidelines." He took a breath. "So if you wanted to go, I'd take you." The question hung in the rain-soaked air. Hannah stared at him, a mix of surprise and a strange burgeoning gratitude swelling in her chest. "Are you asking me to prom, Eli Parker?" A faint blush coloured his neck. "Just as friends," he added quickly, as if to give her an easy out. "So you can go, wear your dress, so he doesn't get to win, that's all." So he doesn't get to win. The thought resonated deep inside her. It was a lifeline. It wasn't about romance or finding a new date. It was about reclaiming a piece of her stolen joy. It was about defiance, and it was being offered by the last person she ever would have expected. She noticed his hands, the ones he was nervously twisting the rag in. They were calloused from work, the knuckles scarred, but his movements were careful, gentle. She'd seen those hands fix fences, calm a spooked calf and replant her mother's peonies after a storm had flattened them. She looked up and caught him watching her, a question in his eyes, and he quickly looked away. In that fleeting glance, she saw something more than just neighbourly concern. She saw a deep, quiet kindness she had always taken for granted. A loud clap of thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the old barn. Hannah didn't flinch. For the first time in 2 days, she felt anchored. She nodded slowly, the flannel jacket a warm, comforting weight on her shoulders. "Okay, Eli," she said, her voice steadier than it had been all week. "As friends." They sat down on a bale of hay, the comfortable silence returning, the rain a steady beat against the roof. But something had changed. An unspoken current had shifted in the air between them, as tangible and electric as the storm raging outside. Prom night arrived on a wave of warm, stardusted air. The chime of the doorbell sent a flutter of nerves through Hannah's stomach, a mix of apprehension and a new, unfamiliar anticipation. Taking one last look in the hall mirror at the girl in the periwinkle chiffon dress, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Eli stood on her porch, framed by the deepening twilight. He was wearing a dark suit that was clearly his father's, the shoulders a little too wide, but it only served to emphasize his own solid frame. His hair was meticulously combed, though a stubborn blonde curl was already staging a rebellion at his temple. In his hands he held a small clear box containing a wrist corsage of white rosebuds. He looked from her face down to her dress and back up again, his own awe genuine and unguarded. "Wow," he breathed, his voice soft. "Hannah, you look beautiful. I mean, you always do, but wow." A warm, pleasant blush crept up her neck. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Parker," she teased gently. "This is for you," he said, looking down at the box in his hand as if just remembering it. With hands that trembled slightly, he opened it and carefully slid the corsage onto her wrist. His touch was hesitant, but his calloused fingertips sent a tiny, unexpected spark up her arm. Her father appeared in the doorway behind her, giving Eli a firm, appraising look before breaking into a smile. "Have a good time, you two," he said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "Drive safe, son." The ride to the community centre in his old pickup truck was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft rock station on the radio and the vast starry sky stretching out on all sides. When they arrived, the familiar gymnasium had been transformed with surprising magic. Glimmering string lights were woven through the basketball hoops, and paper flowers adorned the walls. The floor, polished to a high shine, reflected the lights like a dark, still lake. Eli, clearly out of his element, navigated the loud music and social chaos with a deep-set anxiety she could see in the tight line of his jaw. Yet he did it. For her. He got her punch, made stilted conversation with her friends, and stood by her side like a steadfast guardian. And she found herself watching him, not her classmates. She watched the way he treated people with a simple, unassuming respect, the way his eyes would find hers across the room as if to check if she was okay. Then the DJ slowed things down. The opening chords of Unchained Melody drifted through the gym. Eli stiffened. "We don't have to," he said quickly. "I want to," Hannah heard herself say, and she meant it. She took his hand and led him toward the dance floor. He placed one hand on her waist, his touch light, almost reverent. She rested her other hand on his shoulder. As the song swelled, they found a rhythm, and she rested her head against his chest. She could feel the steady thumping beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm far more grounding than the music. His hand on her back was firm, protective. When did his shoulders get so broad? When did his smile start making my stomach flutter? The questions bloomed in her mind, startling and bright. This wasn't the boy next door anymore. This was Eli. She tilted her head back to look at him. He was already looking at her, and the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with a potent energy. He looked from her eyes to her lips. It was going to happen. A kiss with Ryan had always felt like something for an audience, a confirmation of status. This felt private, sacred. A kiss from Eli, she realized with a jolt that went straight through her, wouldn't be a conquest. It would be a question, an answer, an entire conversation without a single word. It would mean something. He leaned in, his intention clear, his breath warm on her skin. "Hey guys, you have to see this." A classmate clapped Eli on the shoulder, shattering the moment into 1,000 pieces. The spell was broken. They sprang apart, a flush of colour rising in both their faces. The rest of the night passed in a daze, but the memory of that almost kiss lingered, a shimmering, unspoken promise between them. When they walked out into the cool, silent night, everything familiar felt breathtakingly new. The summer that followed was dipped in honey and gold. The almost kiss at prom had unlocked something between them, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Their days fell into a comfortable, sun-drenched rhythm. They worked side by side, Anna helping on the Parker farm when her own chores were done, Eli showing up with his father's tiller to help her dad break new ground for a garden. They were a team. They shared lunches under the shade of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel between their properties, their conversation easy and rambling. They talked about everything and nothing, the price of soybeans, the best way to mend a fence, their secret childhood dreams. Hannah learned that Eli wanted to experiment with no-till farming to preserve the topsoil his grandfather had cherished. She saw the passion in his eyes when he talked about the land, a fierce, protective love she recognized in her own heart. He was not simple, he was rooted. Their stolen glances across the pews at Sunday service were charged with a sweet, simmering tension. One evening, as twilight settled and the fireflies began their blinking dance, he took her hand as they walked back from the treehouse, their childhood hideout. He didn't say anything, just laced his fingers through hers, and it felt more significant than 1,000 flowery speeches. This slow, patient blooming was more real than any whirlwind romance she had ever imagined. Then in late July, the mail truck delivered the future. Thick envelopes arrived for Hannah, one after another. She was accepted to State University, a sprawling campus 3 hours away, with a full scholarship for their pre-law program. It was the dream she had nurtured for years, a way out, a path to a life bigger than the one she knew. Her parents were ecstatic, their pride a palpable force in the house. The sound of combine harvesters filled the air, the dust of the early harvest swirling in the thick afternoon heat. One sweltering afternoon, Hannah was inside shelling peas while her parents talked on the porch, their voices drifting through the open kitchen window. Eli had just dropped off a crate of sun-warmed tomatoes from his mother's garden and was lingering by the steps, about to say goodbye. "She's going to do great things," Hannah's mother said, her voice full of love and ambition for her daughter. "She's so smart, too smart for this small town, for this life." Hannah froze, a pea pod held halfway to the bowl. She knew her mother didn't mean it unkindly. It was a statement of pride. But she chanced to look out the window and saw Eli's posture change. He'd been leaning against the railing, a relaxed smile on his face, but now he stood up straight, his shoulders tight. He didn't look at her parents. He just gave a short clipped nod, murmured something she couldn't hear, and walked away, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look back. He started to pull away after that. The shared lunches became less frequent. His replies to her texts grew shorter. He was always busy, always had an excuse. The easy warmth between them was replaced by a strained, painful distance. The unspoken thing that had blossomed in the summer sun was now withering in a drought of his own making. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She found him at dusk, checking the irrigation lines in a field that bordered their property. "Eli, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why are you pulling away from me?" He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a stubborn sprinkler head. "Nothing's wrong, Hannah. Summer's almost over. You're heading off to a new life." This isn't just about summer," she said, her heart aching. "You know that." He finally looked at her, and his expression was shuttered, guarded. The vulnerability she'd seen at prom was gone, replaced by a mask of indifference. "It was fun, Hannah, that's all. We had a good time." The words were a physical blow. Fun. He was reducing their entire golden summer, the slow dance, the held hands, the shared dreams, to a simple pastime. It was Ryan all over again, but 1,000 times worse, because this time she'd let her heart believe it was real. His internal struggle was invisible to her. She couldn't see his fear, couldn't hear the voice in his head telling him that loving her meant letting her go, that a simple farmer had no business holding back a girl with the world at her feet. All she saw was rejection. Tears blurred her vision. "I can't believe you," she whispered, her voice thick with hurt. She turned and ran, not to the barn and not to the house, but into the sprawling cornfield maze that separated their farms, a place they had played hide and seek in as children. The stalks were high above her head, their dry leaves scratching at her arms and face. She ran until her lungs burned, until she was deep inside the green and gold labyrinth. She finally stumbled to a stop, surrounded on all sides, the setting sun casting long, disorienting shadows. She was completely and utterly lost, in more ways than one. The first month of college was a blur of crowded lecture halls, unfamiliar faces, and a profound sense of displacement. Hannah went through the motions, attending classes and joining study groups, but her heart remained in Nebraska, lost somewhere in a cornfield. The city felt loud and impersonal, the people disconnected from the earth and from each other. She missed the scent of hay, the rumble of a tractor, the vast open sky. She missed Eli. She drove home for the annual harvest festival in early October, craving a dose of familiarity. The town square was alive with the sights and sounds of autumn. Fiddle music mingled with the laughter of children, and the crisp air was fragrant with wood smoke, cinnamon, and roasting corn. Golden leaves drifted down from the maple trees, carpeting the ground in a riot of colour. Hannah, wrapped in a cosy sweater, felt like a tourist in her own life. She saw familiar faces, but the conversations were stilted. Everyone wanted to know about the big city, about her new life, a life that felt increasingly like a costume she was wearing. Then she saw him. Eli was on the main stage, standing next to the town mayor. It was time for the charity pie auction, a festival tradition. The final item was a legendary sour cream raisin pie made from his grandmother's recipe. The bidding was fierce, but Eli outbid everyone, paying a staggering amount for his own family's creation. The mayor announced that all the proceeds from that pie would go directly to the Morrison family, whose farm had been hit hard by a hailstorm over the summer. A wave of warmth spread through Hannah's chest, chasing away some of the lonely chill. She wasn't just watching a boy win an auction, she was seeing the man he was, a man of quiet character, of deep-seated loyalty to his community, of a generosity that didn't require an audience. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, too smart for this life, and for the first time she knew they were wrong. There was a different kind of intelligence, a wisdom of the heart and the land, and Eli had it in spades. She knew where she had to go. She slipped away from the festival crowd and walked the familiar path toward the property line, toward the old oak tree that housed their childhood hideout. She climbed the worn wooden slats nailed into the trunk, her movements sure and steady. He was there. He was sitting on the floor of the treehouse, his back against the far wall, staring out at the festival lights twinkling in the distance. He looked up as she climbed inside, his expression a mixture of surprise and sorrow. "I saw what you did," she said softly, sitting across from him, with the pie. He just shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. The Morrisons needed it. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their summer and the pain of their autumn. Hannah decided she was done with ghosts. "I thought I needed to leave everything behind to find myself, to grow up," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I thought success meant getting as far away from here as possible, but I was wrong. Some roots are worth keeping. Some lives are big enough right where they are." Eli looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I heard your mum that day," he confessed, his voice rough. "She was right. You have so much potential. I was so afraid of holding you back, of being the anchor that kept your ship in the harbour, that I almost let you slip away. I thought that was the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Hannah's heart ached for his misplaced nobility, Eli, the right thing is being honest. The right thing is fighting for what you want. Love isn't about where you end up. It's about who stands beside you along the way. I don't want a life that you're not standing in. The truth, raw and beautiful, settled between them. She told him about her decision, one that had been solidifying for weeks. She was transferring, not back home, but to the state's agricultural college, only an hour away. She was changing her major from pre-law to sustainable agriculture. She wasn't giving up her ambition, she was planting it in the soil that felt like home. He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief, hope, and dawning joy. He crossed the small space in a single movement, kneeling in front of her. He gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I think I've loved you my whole life." Tears of her own streamed down her face, but these were tears of homecoming. "I know," she smiled. "I think I've known all along, too." Under the same canopy of stars where they had almost kissed months before, he leaned in and finally closed the distance. The kiss was not the fumbling exploration of teenagers, but a deep, certain claiming. It tasted of wood smoke and cinnamon, of autumn and forever. It was a promise, a harvest, a coming home. They returned to the festival hand in hand. The fiddle music was playing a lively tune, and he pulled her into the swirl of dancers by the bonfire. As they moved together, their steps finally in sync, Hannah knew their future was still an unploughed field, full of uncertainty and hard work. But for the first time she wasn't afraid. Their love wasn't a grand, loud declaration. It had grown quietly, like corn in rich Nebraska soil, its roots deepening unseen until one day she realized it had become as essential as breath, as strong as the earth, and as enduring as the prairie sky. Coming home wasn't about giving up on a dream. It was about discovering her biggest dream had been waiting patiently next door all along.